Wall Street is 7 blocks long. You can walk from Broadway to the East River, the full length of it, in about 4 minutes, 5 if you stop at Trinity Church to look at the graves. For most of the 20th century, this cramped, narrow canyon of stone and glass was, by any reasonable measure, the richest street on the planet, a place where more money moved on a slow afternoon than most nations generated in a month. And the whole thing started with a pile of wooden planks that Dutch colonists hammered into the mud because they were afraid of the English. The year was 1653, and the settlement was called New Amsterdam. A few hundred people clinging to the southern tip of Manhattan Island, trying to squeeze a living out of the beaver fur trade while worrying constantly about an attack from the north. The Director General of the colony, Peter Stuyvesant, a one-legged, deeply irritable man who governed like someone perpetually running late, ordered the construction of a defensive wall, 12 feet high, built of sharpened timber planks running roughly east to west across the island. The road that ran along its base became known simply as Wall Street. The English came anyway. In 1664, 4 warships sailed into the harbor, and Stuyvesant, unable to rally his colonists to fight, surrendered without firing a shot. New Amsterdam became New York. The wall stood for a few more decades, increasingly pointless, before the British tore it down in 1699. The street kept its name, and for the next 90 years that's all it was, a name on a street in a colonial port town, a place where merchants rented small offices and cargo ships unloaded at the docks a few blocks east. There was a slave market at the eastern end, where human beings were bought and sold alongside grain and livestock. There was a city hall built in 1703. There was a church. It was a street like 100 other streets in 100 other port towns, and if you had told anyone in 1780 that it would one day be the most powerful address on earth, they'd have had no reason to believe you. What changed everything was a man who understood, better than anyone alive, that a country is only as real as its credit. Alexander Hamilton arrived in New York as a teenager from the Caribbean, fought in the Revolution, and by 1784 had founded the Bank of New York, the city's first bank with offices on Wall Street. 5 years later, on April 30th, 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall at 26 Wall Street and took the oath of office as the first president. The very first act of the American Republic happened on Wall Street, and almost immediately, Hamilton, now Secretary of the Treasury, began constructing the financial architecture that would make the street indispensable. He insisted that the federal government assume the war debts of every state, a controversial, expensive, politically brutal decision that transformed Wall Street overnight. The government needed to sell bonds. Bonds needed buyers. Buyers needed a place to trade. And Wall Street had what they needed: the lawyers, the banks, the proximity to the harbor where news arrived first by ship. By 1790, Wall Street was the place in America where you could turn paper into money and money into more paper. It was small, it was informal, and it was about to organize itself in a way that would echo for the next 2.5 centuries. On May 17, 1792, 24 stockbrokers gathered under a buttonwood tree at 68 Wall Street. The buttonwood, an American sycamore, was enormous, the kind of tree that grows wide and generous in the mid-Atlantic climate, with bark that peels in patches to reveal pale wood underneath. The brokers had been rattled by a financial panic earlier that year, triggered by a speculator named William Dewar, who had borrowed himself into catastrophe and taken half the market with him. Alexander Hamilton himself had stepped in to bail out the banks, the country's first financial rescue. Now, these 24 men signed what became known as the Buttonwood Agreement. They would trade securities only among themselves, charge a minimum commission of 0.25%, and give each other preference over outside buyers. 2 sentences. That was the entire document. And it created the institution that would eventually become the New York Stock Exchange. For the next few decades, the exchange was a modest affair, a few dozen men trading government bonds and bank stocks, first under the tree, then in the Tontine Coffee House at the corner of Wall and Water Streets. The Tontine, built in 1793, just a year after the agreement, was a handsome three-story building where brokers gathered on the second floor to call out prices, while ship captains, insurance underwriters, and auctioneers occupied the rooms below. When the weather was good, trading spilled back outside. When it rained, the room upstairs got loud. The securities being traded were few: shares in the Bank of New York, the First Bank of the United States, a handful of insurance companies, and the government bonds that Hamilton had created. It was a small world, intimate and insular, and the men who populated it were making it up as they went along. They passed rules fining members who left the room while stocks were being called, and initially forbade even the publication of prices. Information was power, and they intended to keep it. In 1817, the brokers formalized their arrangements into the New York Stock and Exchange Board, adopted a constitution, and rented a room at 40 Wall Street. The commission rate they set was the same one the Buttonwood signers had agreed to, 1/4%. But something was happening to New York that would make Wall Street indispensable. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened, connecting the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and the Hudson to New York Harbor. Overnight, New York became the commercial gateway to the American interior. Goods, grain, lumber, and livestock flowed through the city in quantities no other American port could match. And all that commerce needed financing: loans for shipping, insurance for cargo, letters of credit for merchants who had never met each other. Wall Street provided every bit of it. By the 1840s, New York had more banks than any city in the country, and nearly all of them were clustered within a few blocks of where that buttonwood tree had stood. On December 15, 1886, trading volume on the exchange topped 1 million shares in a single day for the first time, a number that seemed almost incomprehensible to the brokers who remembered when a few thousand shares constituted a busy afternoon. Then came the Civil War. The federal government needed to finance an army, and it did so by selling bonds, hundreds of millions of dollars in bonds, through Wall Street. Men who had been trading modest sums suddenly found themselves moving quantities of money that dwarfed anything they had imagined. After the war, the railroads came, and with them the first generation of truly colossal American fortunes. In 1867, the stock ticker was invented, and suddenly the prices on Wall Street could be transmitted across the country in minutes, an innovation so significant that Thomas Edison himself worked on improving the device, selling his upgraded version to Gold and Stock Telegraph Company for a reported $40,000. The following year, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk launched the Erie Railroad War, printing fraudulent stock certificates by the thousands, bribing judges to issue contradictory injunctions, and at one point literally fleeing across the Hudson River to New Jersey with suitcases full of cash to avoid arrest, setting up operations in a hotel they surrounded with armed guards. Every move in this grotesque drama was orchestrated from offices within walking distance of 68 Wall Street. In 1869, Gould attempted something even more audacious. He tried to corner the entire American gold market, enlisting a network of brokers and even cultivating a relationship with President Grant's brother-in-law to keep the government from selling its gold reserves. When the scheme collapsed on September 24th, a day the newspapers called Black Friday, the resulting panic ruined speculators from New York to San Francisco and brought several brokerage houses to their knees. On October 28, 1886, New York held a parade for the dedication of the Statue of Liberty. And as the procession passed through the financial district, workers in the office buildings above Wall Street began tearing long ribbons of used ticker tape from their machines and throwing them out the windows. It was spontaneous, unplanned, and it became a tradition. The ticker tape parade, one of the most American of all public celebrations, born from the specific material culture of a single street. The confetti was literally made of money, or at least the paper that recorded money's movements. But the man who truly made Wall Street the center of American power arrived in 1857 and spent the next half-century making the street synonymous with his own name. John Pierpont Morgan was born in Hartford, Connecticut, educated in Switzerland and Germany, and arrived in New York with the calm certainty that the financial world existed to be organized and that he was the one to organize it. By the 1880s, operating from offices at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, Morgan had become something unprecedented in the country's history, a private citizen more powerful than most governments. He reorganized the railroads, not one or two, but entire systems, consolidating competing lines into rational networks that actually functioned. He financed the creation of U.S. Steel in 1901, the first billion-dollar corporation in history, assembled from Andrew Carnegie's steel empire and a constellation of smaller firms in a deal that valued the new company at $1.4 billion, a figure so large that people struggled to comprehend it. He did it all from a building on Wall Street, and the proximity of his office to the stock exchange, literally across the street, was both practical and symbolic. The exchange was the marketplace. Morgan was the market. By the early 1900s, Wall Street had become a global institution. In 1904, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia sent the exchange a Fabergé urn to commemorate the NYSE's listing of $2 billion in Russian bonds, a gesture of diplomatic courtesy from one empire to what was effectively becoming another. The bonds, of course, became worthless after the Russian Revolution. The urn survived. In 1895, the United States Treasury was nearly out of gold. The country was on the gold standard, meaning every dollar was supposed to be backed by actual metal in a government vault, and the reserves had dropped so low that the nation was days from default. President Grover Cleveland, desperate, turned to Morgan. Morgan proposed a plan. He would personally organize a syndicate of bankers to purchase $62 million in gold bonds, replenishing the Treasury's reserves. Cleveland agreed. One man from one office on one street had rescued the credit of the United States of America. Not the Federal Reserve, it did not exist yet. Not Congress, one banker. Remember that detail. It becomes important later. When Morgan's bank built a new headquarters at 23 Wall Street in 1913, the architects, Trowbridge and Livingston, gave it a facade of pale Tennessee marble, 4 stories high, monumental and austere, with no name on the exterior. It did not need one. Everyone knew whose building it was. They called it simply the Corner. The building it replaced, the old Drexel building, completed in 1873, had been the first office building in the world illuminated by electric light when Thomas Edison flipped the switch on September 4th, 1882, powering the lamps from his Pearl Street generating station a few blocks away. In an era when every other financial firm in Lower Manhattan was racing skyward, the Corner stayed low, a deliberate statement. The Morgan Bank did not need height to project power. The building's 4 stories contained more influence than any skyscraper on the street. Anthony Drexel, Morgan's original partner, had bought the site back in 1872 for $348 per square foot, making it the most expensive plot of land in New York City at the time. By 1913, the land alone was assessed at $2.5 million. The building that went up on it was, square foot for square foot, the most consequential office in the country. The same year the Corner was completed, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, creating the central bank that exists to this day. And this is where the detail from 1895 pays off. The panic of 1907, 6 years before the Fed's creation, had been stopped almost single-handedly by Morgan. He was 70 years old, operating from his private library on 36th Street, personally deciding which banks were worth saving and which were not. He locked a group of bank presidents in his library one night and refused to let them leave until they committed their own funds to halt the panic. They agreed around 4 in the morning. The Federal Reserve was, in a sense, Wall Street's greatest compliment and its greatest constraint. The government had built an entire institution to replace the power of one man at one address. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most important of the 12 regional banks, the one that actually conducts market operations, was built at 33 Liberty Street, 1 block north of Wall Street. Its vault, sunk 80 feet into the bedrock of Manhattan Island, would eventually hold more gold bullion than Fort Knox. And then, on a warm Thursday in September, someone tried to blow Wall Street up. September 16th, 1920, just before noon, the bells of Trinity Church were tolling 12. A nondescript man guided a horse-drawn wagon to the curb in front of 23 Wall Street, the corner Morgan's building, and walked away into the crowd. The wagon was loaded with about 100 pounds of dynamite and 500 pounds of cast-iron sash weights designed to act as shrapnel. At 12:01, it detonated. The blast killed 30 people instantly. 8 more died of their injuries in the days that followed. Hundreds were wounded. Windows shattered for blocks. A trolley 2 blocks away was knocked off its tracks. The white marble of the corner was gouged with shrapnel marks, deep, ragged pits in the stone, some of them an inch across. The perpetrators were never identified. The Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner of the FBI, spent 3 years chasing leads and never made an arrest. The best guess, then and now, is that Italian anarchists were responsible. Here is the detail that says everything about Wall Street in 1920. The stock exchange, which had suspended trading immediately after the blast, reopened the next morning. The following day, thousands of people gathered at the same intersection for a previously scheduled Constitution Day rally in open defiance of the bombers. And Morgan's Bank never repaired the shrapnel scars. They are still there, still visible on the facade of 23 Wall Street more than a century later. Leaving them was understood at the time as defiance. The marks said plainly that the street was bigger than any bomb. The 1920s were Wall Street's golden age. The country was booming, the stock market was climbing, and the street itself was being rebuilt in stone and steel to match the scale of the money flowing through it. The New York Stock Exchange had already moved into its grand neoclassical building at 11 Wall Street in 1903, a Corinthian columned facade designed by George B. Post that deliberately evoked a Roman temple crowned with a sculptural pediment called Integrity Protecting the Works of Man. The trading floor inside was enormous, paneled in Georgian marble, with huge windows and a gilded ceiling 4 stories above the traders' heads. When telephones were installed on the floor in 1878, the exchange became one of the most technologically connected places in the world. Now, in the 1920s, the surrounding blocks were filling with towers that seemed to grow taller by the month. At 40 Wall Street, the Bank of Manhattan Trust Building rose 71 stories in a race with the Chrysler Building uptown for the title of tallest building in the world. The building cost $24 million and was erected at a pace that seems almost reckless today. The steel frame went up so fast that 4 workers died during construction, a mortality rate that was considered normal for the era. The architect, H. Craig Severance, and his former business partner, William Van Allen, who was designing the Chrysler, had been rivals since their firm dissolved in 1924. Severance pushed his building to 927 feet, confident he had won. He was wrong. Van Allen had secretly constructed a 125-foot stainless steel spire inside the Chrysler's dome, and on October 23, 1929, one day before the stock market crash, workers hoisted it into position in 90 minutes, bringing the Chrysler to 1,046 feet. 40 Wall Street held the title of tallest building in the world for roughly a month. It was, and remains, the tallest building on Wall Street itself. Next door at 1 Wall Street, the Irving Trust Company commissioned the architect Ralph Walker to design what became one of the finest Art Deco buildings in America. Walker sculpted the limestone facade into gentle curtain-like folds that shimmered in the light. One critic said the building appeared as if chiseled from a single piece of stone. And inside, he and the muralist Hildreth Mayer created the Red Room, a triple-height banking hall covered floor to ceiling in thousands of tiny glass mosaic tiles, fabricated by the German firm Poole and Wagner, glowing in waves of red and gold. Frank Lloyd Wright called Walker the only other honest architect in America. The American Institute of Architects later voted him Architect of the Century. One Wall Street is a significant part of the reason why. By the summer of 1929, the street was physically magnificent, a corridor of skyscrapers, banks, and trading houses that announced in every cornice and column that this was the place where American capitalism lived. The market was up more than 300% from where it had been 5 years earlier. Taxi drivers bought stocks. The economist Irving Fisher declared publicly that prices had reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. On Thursday, October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, the market dropped sharply at the opening bell. By noon, the trading floor was chaos. A group of the most powerful bankers in the country met at 23 Wall Street, the corner, Morgan's building, and pooled their resources. They sent Richard Whitney, the vice president of the exchange, onto the floor to make conspicuous purchases. Whitney walked to the post where U.S. Steel was traded and placed an order for 10,000 shares at $205, well above the current price. It was theater as much as finance, a deliberate performance of confidence. The market steadied. For one afternoon, it seemed to work. It did not hold. The following Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, the market fell so fast that the ticker tape ran hours behind the actual trades. More than 16 million shares changed hands, a record that would stand for nearly 4 decades. By mid-November, the market had lost roughly $30 billion in value, something like $500 billion in today's money. The crash did not cause the Great Depression on its own, but it announced it. And it announced it from Wall Street. The Depression and the New Deal changed Wall Street's relationship with the rest of the country permanently. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 imposed federal regulation on the markets for the first time. The Glass-Steagall Act forced a wall, there is that word again, between commercial banking and investment banking. The Securities and Exchange Commission was established. For the first time in its history, Wall Street was being told what it could and could not do by people who did not work on Wall Street. The street hated Roosevelt. He was not troubled. The regulations did not diminish Wall Street. They stabilized it. The post-war decades from roughly 1945 to 1970 were a period of steady, respectable growth. The firms on the street were partnerships, not public corporations, which meant the partners risked their own money on every deal. This concentrated the mind. The culture was clubby, conservative, overwhelmingly male and white. A world of 3 martini lunches, wood-paneled boardrooms, and the unshakable conviction that what was good for Wall Street was good for the country. The street was a physical ecosystem. Traders, analysts, runners, clerks, and secretaries all crammed into buildings within a few blocks of each other, doing business face-to-face, by telephone, and over lunch. At its peak, the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange employed about 5,000 people, men in colored mesh-back jackets, some following their fathers and grandfathers into the profession, filling the room with a roar of shouted orders that could be heard through the walls. Outside, on Broad Street, the curb brokers, traders who were not members of the exchange and conducted their business literally on the curb of the street, using hand signals to communicate with clerks leaning out of upper-floor windows, had finally moved indoors in 1921, forming what would become the American Stock Exchange. But even after they moved inside, the brokers kept the hand signals. There was a physical intimacy to the whole operation that is hard to recapture now. If you wanted to buy 10,000 shares of General Motors, you did not type an order into a terminal. You called your broker, who called a clerk, who gave a slip of paper to a runner, often a teenager, sometimes the partner's nephew, who sprinted across the trading floor to the post where GM was traded, where a specialist matched buy and sell orders in a leather-bound book. The information traveled at the speed of a young man's legs. The specialist knew every regular buyer and seller by name and by temperament and by the sound of their voice. The system was inefficient, personal, occasionally corrupt, and for a long time it worked. It worked because the entire business depended on trust, and trust in those years depended on proximity, on being in the room, on seeing the other man's eyes, on knowing that your handshake meant something because you would be standing in the same spot tomorrow. The first crack in this world came in 1971 when a new stock exchange called NASDAQ opened for business. NASDAQ had no trading floor. It existed entirely on electronic screens, a network of dealers connected by telephone and computer terminal, trading stocks without ever standing in the same room. The men on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange regarded it as a curiosity, a minor league operation for small companies that could not get listed on the real exchange. They were wrong about nearly everything except the small company part, and even that would not last. The second crack came on May 1st, 1975, May Day on Wall Street, when the SEC abolished fixed commissions. Those were the same fixed commissions that the 24 brokers under the Buttonwood tree had agreed to in 1792. For 183 years, brokers on Wall Street had charged the same minimum percentage on every trade. Abolishing fixed commissions meant that trading became a competitive business for the first time, and competition meant that profits per trade dropped, and dropping profits meant that firms needed to trade in much larger volumes to make the same money. Volume meant speed. Speed meant technology. And technology meant that the value of being physically present on a trading floor, in a specific building, on a specific street, began very quietly to diminish. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the transformation accelerated. The old partnerships became public corporations. Morgan Stanley in 1986, Goldman Sachs, the last major holdout, in 1999. Going public meant the partners were no longer risking their own money. They were risking their shareholders' money, which is a fundamentally different proposition. The new firms were bigger, more aggressive, and less anchored to the physical street. Why pay for premium real estate on Wall Street when you could get more space in Midtown Manhattan or in a data center in New Jersey where servers could execute trades in microseconds? Morgan's bank moved out of the corner to 60 Wall Street in 1990. By the early 2000s, J.P. Morgan Chase decamped for Midtown entirely, leaving Wall Street behind. The trading floor of the stock exchange, once a cathedral of capitalism where thousands of men screamed buy and sell orders across a room the size of a basketball court, began to empty. Electronic trading systems matched buyers and sellers faster and cheaper than any human being. The open outcry system was formally eliminated in 2006, when the NYSE merged with ARCA, an all-electronic exchange. The specialists who had stood at their posts for generations, men whose families had held those positions for decades, were being replaced by algorithms that could execute 10,000 trades in the time it takes a human heart to beat once. By the 2000s, the floor had shrunk from 5,000 people to about 2,000, and the number kept falling. At Suspenders, the bar near the exchange, where traders had celebrated big gains and drowned their sorrows for years, the owner said it was not uncommon for regulars to come in clutching pink slips. The room remained open, increasingly as a television backdrop, a ceremonial space where companies rang a bell on the day they went public, and CNBC anchors stood in front of screens delivering market updates. The actual trading happened elsewhere. Then came September 11th, 2001. The World Trade Center stood just a few blocks southwest of Wall Street, and when the towers fell, the financial district was buried in dust and debris. The stock exchange closed for 4 trading days, the longest shutdown since 1933. When it reopened on September 17th, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 684 points, at the time the largest single-day point drop in history. Lower Manhattan, already losing firms to Midtown, suddenly felt fragile and exposed. The area around Wall Street, once the most desirable business address in the Western Hemisphere, began to seem like a place people wanted to leave rather than arrive. The rebuilding was slow, and the neighborhood that emerged was not the neighborhood that had been. Firms that might have stayed found cheaper space in Midtown or New Jersey. The population of Lower Manhattan, paradoxically, began to grow, not with bankers and traders, but with residents. Developers discovered that the grand old financial buildings, with their high ceilings, thick walls, marble lobbies, and ornamental detail that no modern developer would pay for, made magnificent luxury housing. The conversion happened building by building, block by block, transforming a neighborhood that had been deserted after 6 o'clock every evening into one that had strollers on the sidewalks and grocery stores on the corners. 23 Wall Street, the corner, Morgan's Fortress, the building with the shrapnel scars, was sold in 2003, along with the adjacent 15 Broad Street, for $100 million. The two buildings were converted into luxury condominiums called Downtown by Philippe Stark, with apartments listed between $770,000 and $11 million. A rooftop pool overlooking the stock exchange, a bowling alley, and a yoga studio. The most powerful business address in American history became a place where people walked their dogs past the spot where a bomb killed 38 people in 1920. 1 Wall Street, Ralph Walker's Art Deco masterpiece, the building with the red room, was sold to a developer in 2014 and converted into 566 condominium apartments. The Red Room, closed to the public since 2001, underwent a $1 million restoration of its mosaic tiles. It is now part of a French department store. The financial crisis of 2008 was, in one sense, Wall Street's final act as a physical place. The crisis was generated by Wall Street firms, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, AIG, through mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps so complex that even the people selling them could not always explain how they worked. But most of the decisive meetings took place at the Federal Reserve Bank on Liberty Street, or in Midtown, or in Washington. Lehman Brothers, when it filed for the largest bankruptcy in American history on September 15, 2008, was headquartered at 745 7th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, 30 blocks north of Wall Street. Bear Stearns had been at 383 Madison Avenue. Merrill Lynch was on Vesey Street, technically in Lower Manhattan, but not on Wall Street itself. The crisis carried the street's name. Politicians railed against Wall Street greed. Protesters would eventually camp out in Zuccotti Park under the banner Occupy Wall Street. But the street itself was almost a bystander to its own catastrophe. The name had become more powerful than the place. Today, if you walk down Wall Street on a weekday morning, you will see tourists taking photographs in front of the stock exchange, office workers carrying coffee, and a surprising number of strollers. Concrete bollards and security barriers line the approaches, designed, after 9/11, to prevent another vehicle attack, and later redesigned with bronze facings that echo the grand doorways of the surrounding buildings. The street itself is partly closed to through traffic, requiring security checks for vehicles. The buildings are still magnificent. The columns of the Exchange, the shimmering deco facade of 1 Wall Street, the brooding mass of the Federal Reserve Vault a block to the north. Trinity Church still stands at the head of the street, its graveyard still holding Alexander Hamilton's remains, its spire long since dwarfed by the towers that rose around it. The Buttonwood tree is gone, toppled by a storm on June 14, 1865, 3 years after the Exchange moved indoors for good. A new Buttonwood tree was planted outside the stock exchange at some point, a symbolic gesture, but it is not the tree. There is a plaque at the corner of Wall and Pearl Streets commemorating the agreement that was signed in its shade, but the spot is easy to walk past without noticing. The New York Stock Exchange still operates at 11 Wall Street, but the floor that once employed 5,000 people now runs with a few hundred, and only about 12% of its buy and sell orders actually pass through the physical trading room. The real trading, trillions of dollars a day, happens in a data center in Mahwah, New Jersey, 40 miles from Wall Street, where fiber optic cables are cut to precisely equal lengths so that no trader's electronic signal reaches the matching engine a nanosecond before another's. A former floor trader, reflecting on the change, called the trading floor a graveyard. Here is the thing about Wall Street that separates it from every other street in the world. Most famous streets are famous for what they are: the Champs-Élysées for its beauty, the Las Vegas Strip for its spectacle, Fifth Avenue for its shops. Wall Street became famous for what it represented, and then the representation consumed the reality. Say Wall Street anywhere on Earth, in Tokyo, in Sao Paulo, in Lagos, and people understand exactly what you mean. They do not mean a street. They mean money. They mean the American financial system. They mean capitalism itself in all its creative energy and all its destructive indifference. The name traveled so far from the physical place that the physical place became almost irrelevant to its own meaning. The men who hammered logs into the mud in 1653 were building a wall to protect themselves from an enemy they could see coming. The brokers who stood under the Buttonwood tree in 1792 were creating a market they could touch: paper certificates, physical handshakes, the shade of an actual tree. For 2 centuries, Wall Street was a place where you had to be present to participate, where fortunes were made and lost by men who looked each other in the eye, where the buildings themselves, the marble, the columns, the trading floors, were the architecture of trust. You knew your counterparty was real because he was standing 3 feet away from you shouting. You knew the money was real because you could walk to the vault and see the gold. You knew the street was the center of the world because every morning 5,000 men put on jackets and walked through its doors to do the only work that mattered. And then the money learned to move at the speed of light, and it left. The shrapnel marks are still on the facade of 23 Wall Street. A century of rain and soot and sun have softened their edges a little, but they are there. Small, dark pits in pale stone at about chest height, right at the corner where Broad Street meets Wall. Most of the people who pass them every day have no idea what they are. The building has been largely vacant since 2008, owned by a murky consortium with ties to Angola and Hong Kong, occasionally used for events. There was talk of turning it into a bowling alley and entertainment complex, a cruise ship on land at the most hallowed address in American finance. The scars from the day someone tried to destroy the most powerful street in the world are still embedded in the marble, and the building that wears them waits for someone to decide what it is now. The wall came down in 1699. It took the street 300 years to follow it.